Abigail Carter did not cry when her sister ran. She did not cry when she climbed aboard that train alone, wearing borrowed clothes and carrying a name that did not belong to her. She did not cry when the conductor called the last stop and her hands would not stop shaking. But when that tall, broad-shouldered rancher looked straight through her past, the dress, past the lie, past everything she had pretended to be, and said those 4 quiet words that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. Abigail Carter finally understood. Some doors close so that the right one can open. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1882 arrived in Red Rock, Wyoming, the way it always did, without mercy and without apology. The sun hammered down on the platform boards until they groaned under the heat, and the air smelled of coal smoke and dry earth, and something else entirely that Abigail Carter could not name. She stood at the edge of the platform with one battered suitcase at her feet, and her sister's letter folded tight in her left hand, and she told herself for the 14th time since Missouri that she was not afraid. She was lying. She had been lying since Kansas City. The letter had arrived at their boarding house on a Tuesday morning, addressed to her sister Clara, in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who did not waste words. Abigail had read it before Clara even woke up, because that was the kind of woman she was. Practical, thorough. The one who handled the details while Clara handled everything else, which mostly meant being beautiful and unreliable in equal measure. The letter was from a man named Caleb Whitmore of Red Rock, Wyoming. He ran cattle. He owned land. He had answered a matrimonial advertisement that Clara had placed 3 months earlier without telling a single soul, and he had written to say that he was a straightforward man who did not believe in long courtships and longer letters. He had a ranch that needed managing, and a life that needed a partner, and if Miss Clara Carter was serious in her intentions, he would meet her at the Red Rock station on the 15th of July. Clara had read the letter over Abigail's shoulder, taken a long sip of her coffee, and said, "I can't go." Abigail had turned around slowly. "What do you mean you can't go?" "I mean I met someone." Clara had smiled the way she always smiled when she knew she was about to cause damage. "His name is Thomas. He's from Boston. We're leaving next week." Clara. Abigail had set the letter down on the table between them. "You placed that advertisement. You made a commitment to this man." "I made a letter," Clara said. "That's all it was." "He's expecting you." "Then he'll be disappointed." Clara had stood, smoothed her skirt, and carried her coffee toward the window. "Send him a note if you like. Tell him I changed my mind." Abigail had stared at her sister's back for a long moment. Then she had looked down at the letter again, at the address, at the date, at the name. She had not made the decision consciously. That was what she would tell herself later, that it was not a real decision at all, that it simply happened, the way certain things simply happen when a woman has spent 27 years being the responsible one and has finally run clean out of options. She had $3 to her name. She had no position waiting for her in Missouri. The school where she had worked as a bookkeeper had closed in April, and the family she had been boarding with had already rented her room to someone else. There was nowhere to go back to. So she had written a return letter to Caleb Whitmore of Red Rock, Wyoming. She had signed it Clara Carter, and 2 weeks later she had boarded a train heading west with her sister's name in her mouth like a stone she could not swallow and could not spit out. She had told herself it was temporary. She would explain everything when she arrived. She would apologize. She would offer to work just for a season, just long enough to save money for a real start somewhere else. She would not pretend to be Clara. She would tell him the truth within the first 5 minutes, and whatever happened after that would happen. She had believed that. All the way to Laramie, she had believed it. But now she was standing on the platform in Red Rock, Wyoming, and the man at the far end of it was walking toward her, and he was not what she had expected. She had expected someone older. Someone soft around the middle and desperate around the eyes, the kind of man who placed advertisements because he had no other choices left. She had built that version of him carefully in her mind across 3 days of train travel because it was easier to face a man like that. A man like that she could handle. Caleb Whitmore was not that man. Howe was tall, genuinely tall. The kind of tall that came from work and not pretension, and he moved across the platform with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life been in a hurry because everything in his territory waited for him. He wore a brown leather vest over a white shirt that had seen better days, and his boots were the boots of a working man, worn at the toe and honest about it. His hat was pushed back just enough to see his face, and his face was. Abigail registered this with a small and inconvenient shock. His face was striking. Not handsome the way Clara would have called handsome. Harder than that. More worn. Dark brown hair, jaw like a decision that had already been made, and eyes that she could not read from 10 yards away, but that were fixed on her with an attention she did not know what to do with. He stopped 4 feet from her. He looked at the letter in his hand. Then he looked at her. Then he said, "You're not her." It was not a question. Abigail's mouth went dry. Around them she was aware of the platform filling with the ordinary business of a small western town. Men loading cargo, women collecting packages, children underfoot. But she felt abruptly, sharply, as though every one of them had stopped what they were doing to listen. "Sir," she started, "the woman who wrote these letters." He held up the envelope without unfolding it. His voice was quiet. That was the thing she noticed most. He did not raise it. He did not need to. She described herself: height, coloring, age. He looked at Abigail with the same calm, measuring assessment he might apply to a piece of land he was considering. "You don't match." "I can explain." "I'm sure you can." He did not sound interested in the explanation. He folded the envelope and tucked it back into his vest pocket and looked past her briefly at the train, as though calculating whether it had already left and whether it mattered. "Where is she?" Abigail straightened her spine. She had known this moment was coming. She had rehearsed it on the train in every iteration she could imagine. She had planned to be calm, factual, clear. What she said instead was, "She's in Boston. She met someone. She won't be coming." The silence that followed was approximately 1,000 years long. "Boston," Caleb Whitmore said. "Yes, sir." "She met someone." "Yes." He absorbed this. His expression did not change in any way that Abigail could identify, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that moved through and passed and became something else entirely before she could name it. Then he looked at her again, fully, the way he had looked at the letter. "And you are?" "Abigail," she said. "Abigail Carter, Clara's sister. I wanted to explain in person. I thought it was the least I could do after." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I came to apologize on her behalf, and to return whatever correspondence you'd like returned. And then I'll be on my way." "On your way where?" It was not a question either. He asked it the way he seemed to ask everything, flatly, without inflection, as though he were noting something into a ledger and waiting for the accurate figure. Abigail opened her mouth, closed it. The $3 in her purse felt suddenly like a physical weight around her neck. "That," she said carefully, "is still being determined." Something happened in his face. It was small, so small she almost missed it. But it was there, the edge of something that in a different man she might have called amusement, and in this man she did not know what to call at all. "Determined," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up her suitcase. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Ranch is 2 miles out." He was already walking. "You can explain the rest on the way." Abigail stood completely still for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up the hem of her skirt and followed him, because there was nothing else to do, and because she realized with a clarity that arrived like cold water, she did not actually have anywhere else to go. The wagon ride to Whitmore Ranch was not what Abigail would have called comfortable. Caleb Whitmore drove with his attention on the road, and his hands loose on the reins, and he asked questions the way a man inventories a supply list steadily without emotion, checking items off as they were accounted for. How old was she? What work had she done? Did she have family expecting her somewhere? Did anyone know she had come? She answered honestly. All of it. The boarding house. The school closing. The $3. Clara's departure. The letter she had written under her sister's name, and the reason she had given up telling herself it was a good idea somewhere around the Kansas border. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You traveled 500 miles to apologize for someone else's mistake. It seemed like the right thing to do. That's a long way for the right thing. Someone had to." He looked at the road. Why you? Abigail thought about that. Because she wasn't going to. The silence stretched out again. A hawk turned lazy circles somewhere above the grassland to their left. The horses moved at a walk that suggested they knew this road well and had opinions about being hurried on it. "I need a bookkeeper," Caleb said. Abigail turned to look at him. "I'm sorry. Ranch accounts are a mess. Had a man doing them who left in April. Before that, my wife—" He stopped. A muscle worked in his jaw. He started again. "The accounts need work. I've got a hired hand who can cook. I need someone who can manage the books and help run the house. Mr. Whitmore, room and board and $8 a month." He said it the way he said everything. Flat. Decided. 30 days. You get the accounts in order, do your share of the work. After 30 days, I'll pay your train fare home, wherever home is by then." He paused. "Or I'll offer you a longer arrangement if the work suits. Your choice at the end." Abigail stared at him. She was aware of the weight of everything she did not know about this man, whether he was trustworthy, whether the house would be safe, whether this was the kind of offer that came with conditions she hadn't seen yet. She was also aware of the $3, of the closed school, of the rented room. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you traveled 500 miles to do the right thing by a man you'd never met," he said. "That's enough to start." She looked at the road ahead. At the land opening up wide and dry and enormous around them, nothing like Missouri, nothing like anything she had known. $8, she said. $8. And I keep my own room. Obviously. And if I find the accounts in order already, we renegotiate. He glanced at her sideways. "They're not in order. We renegotiate anyway." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Fair enough," he said. The ranch house was not what she had imagined either, though by this point Abigail had largely given up imagining and was simply recording. It was solid. That was the first thing. It had been built by someone who intended it to last, with good stone in the foundation and walls that met at true corners, and a roof that had clearly been repaired recently and repaired well. The yard was a different matter. Fences wanted mending. The kitchen garden had gone mostly to scrub, and there was a general air about the property of capable bones wearing worn-out clothes. 2 ranch hands came out to meet the wagon. One was short and weathered, with a face like a friendly creek bed, and he introduced himself as Pete. The other was taller, younger, watching Abigail with undisguised curiosity, and he introduced himself as Danny. Behind them, a woman appeared in the doorway of the house, perhaps 50 solid, with the expression of someone who had seen considerable amounts of nonsense and had developed a calm relationship with it. Her name was May, and she cooked, and she took one long look at Abigail and another at Caleb, and said in a tone that managed to be both completely neutral and entirely comprehensible, "I'll put the coffee on." Pete showed Abigail to a room off the back of the house that was small and clean and had a window that faced east. The mattress was good. The washstand was solid. On the windowsill, someone had left a small clay pot with a dried flower in it that had once been yellow. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with her suitcase at her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and she thought, "You are in Wyoming. You have accepted a job from a stranger. You signed your sister's name to a letter and boarded a train, and now you are here." Then she stood up, unpacked her 2 good dresses, and her books, and her ledger, and her pen case, and went to find the accounts. They were, as Caleb Whitmore had indicated, not in order. They were, in fact, in a state that Abigail might charitably have described as creative, and would more accurately have described as catastrophic. 3 years of ranch expenses had been recorded in 4 different ledger books in at least 3 different handwriting styles, 2 of which she suspected belonged to the same person, writing on different days of the week. Supply costs were inconsistent. Livestock tallies didn't match purchase records. And there was a column of figures in the third book added in a hand that was neat and precise and heartbreakingly careful that stopped without explanation in February of 1879. She looked at that column for a long time. Then she found a fresh sheet of paper and started from the beginning. She was still at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock that evening when Caleb came in from the last check of the stock. He stopped when he saw her. She was surrounded by 4 open ledgers, 2 stacks of receipts, and a growing column of her own figures that were already beginning to make the situation slightly less catastrophic. "You didn't have to start tonight," he said. "I know." She did not look up. "But I wanted to see the shape of the problem before I went to sleep." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the spread of work across his kitchen table without comment. "And," he said finally, "you're owed money by 3 different buyers who haven't paid in more than a year," she said. "Your feed supplier has been overcharging you by approximately 12%, which I suspect someone noticed in February of 1879 and stopped recording after." She set down her pen and looked up at him. "Also, your fencing costs are wrong. Whoever was buying the materials was taking a cut." Caleb stood very still. "The hand who left in April," Abigail said carefully. "Did he handle purchasing?" Something crossed his face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. "He did," Caleb said. He crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot May had left, and stood with his back to the room for a moment. When he turned around, his expression was the same as it had always been, settled, unreadable, that quality of a man who had learned to keep things inside, because outside was where they could hurt you. "How bad?" he said. "I need 2 more days to know exactly." She looked down at her figures. "But the buyers who owe you, if you can get those payments in it, covers the loss from the purchasing, and then some." She paused. "It's not ruined. It's been neglected. That's different." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know the difference." "I was a bookkeeper for 6 years," she said. "I know the difference." He nodded slowly. Then he set his cup down, picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and said, "Good night, Miss Carter." "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." He stopped with his hand on the doorframe, did not turn around. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. "Thank you." He said it quietly. No performance in it. Just the word placed down on the table between them like something real. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the ledgers and the lamp, and outside the Wyoming night was enormous and full of stars, and somewhere in the dark a dog barked twice and then went quiet. Abigail picked up her pen. She told herself she was staying because of the $8, because of the train fare at the end of 30 days, because of the $3 she had started with and the nowhere she'd had to go back to. She told herself that, and she kept writing, and the lamp burned low, and the house settled quietly around her, like something that had been waiting a long time for someone to stay in it. She met the town on the 3rd day. Caleb needed supplies from Red Rock, and May had a list that required a trip, and Abigail volunteered because she needed to price lumber anyway for the fence repairs she had already calculated into the new budget. They took the smaller wagon, just the 2 of them, and the ride-in was quiet, in the way that their silences had already begun to be. Not uncomfortable, not filled with things unsaid, but simply what happened when 2 people did not feel the need to talk constantly to prove they were present. Red Rock was not a large town. It had a main street with a general store, a bank, a post office, a saloon, a church, and the specific kind of civic pride that small towns develop when they know they are not large and have decided to be excellent at being small instead. People on the street turned to look at the wagon when it pulled up. Several of them looked at Caleb, then at Abigail, then back at Caleb with expressions that ranged from curious to something that Abigail recognized from considerable personal experience as the pre-gossip position. A woman in a green dress appeared on the steps of the general store and called out, "Caleb Whitmore, as I live and breathe, is this your mail-order bride?" She said the last 3 words with a brightness that had a point on it. "Supply run, Mrs. Holt," Caleb said without stopping. "Morning." Mrs. Holt's eyes followed Abigail with the focus of a woman who intended to have information by sundown. Inside the general store, the proprietor was a man named Garrett, who had the manner of someone who had heard everything twice and was prepared to hear it again. He greeted Caleb by name and looked at Abigail with professional neutrality and began pulling items from May's list. It was when Abigail was examining the lumber prices along the back wall that she heard it. Two women not bothering with quiet over by the fabric bolts. She came from Missouri, they say. Clara something. Except Millie's boy was at the station, and he says she's not who she claimed. You don't say. I do say. Caleb looked at her, and you could have heard a pin drop. Clara something. Shows up with one bag, and no husband, and no explanation, and next thing she's living out at the Whitmore place. Well, I'm only saying what people are wondering. Man like Caleb still grieving, and a woman just appears from nowhere, with some story about her sister. Abigail set down the price sheet she had been looking at and walked back to where Caleb was waiting at the counter. The lumber is overpriced, she said. There's a mill 12 miles east that will deliver for less. I'll write to them this afternoon. He looked at her, then just briefly at the fabric section, then back at her. All right, he said. She did not ask if he had heard. He did not pretend he hadn't. They loaded the supplies and drove back to the ranch in the same settled quiet, and the town watched them go, with the particular enthusiasm of people who have identified a story and intend to follow it. On the fifth day, a man named Virgil Marsh rode up to the property line. Abigail was mending the kitchen garden fence. Small work, honest work. The kind that felt good in the hands when she heard the hoofbeats and looked up. Marsh was perhaps 45, well-dressed in the Western manner, which meant his clothes were expensive, but made to look like they weren't. He sat his horse the way wealthy men sit horses, as though the animal is an accessory. He did not dismount. Miss Carter, he called, and the fact that he knew her name was its own kind of message. I've been meaning to introduce myself, Virgil Marsh. I run the valley south of here. Mr. Marsh. She did not move from the fence. Mr. Whitmore isn't in. That's all right. It's you I wanted to speak to. He smiled. It was a capable smile, well practiced. I heard you had a look at the Whitmore accounts. Something went very still inside her. I'm the bookkeeper, she said. That's my job. Of course it is. He leaned forward on his saddle horn. I'm a reasonable man, Miss Carter, and I have a proposal for you that I think you'll find worth considering. A woman in your position alone, unconnected, working for a man who by all accounts isn't the warmest company. Well, there are better positions available, better pay, more comfortable arrangements. I have a contract, she said. Contracts can be reconsidered. Mine can't. He smiled again, and this time the capability of it went somewhere else. You found something in those books, he said. I can see it in you. You're a clever woman. Clever women know when information is worth more as a quiet thing than a loud one. Abigail looked at him steadily for a long moment. Mr. Marsh, she said, I think you rode a long way to say something you'd have been better off not saying. I'm going to go back to this fence now, and when Mr. Whitmore returns, I'm going to tell him you stopped by. She picked up her mending tool. Good day. He sat for a moment longer. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and Abigail watched him go with her hands perfectly steady, and her pulse doing something considerably less calm underneath her ribs. She told herself it was nothing, a fishing expedition, a man testing to see what she knew, but she went back to the ledgers that evening and looked at the fencing costs again, and the lumber costs, and the name of the man who had been selling those supplies to the ranch at the marked-up price. The name was not one she recognized, but the mill. It pointed back to the mill that had been overcharging Caleb Whitmore for 3 years while someone took a cut of every invoice was 12 miles east. The same direction Virgil Marsh had come from. She sat with that for a long time. Then she folded the paper, put it in her ledger, and locked the ledger in her trunk. And when Caleb came in from the evening rounds and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the way he had taken to looking at her lately, as though he was still not sure what to make of something he had not expected to find, she looked up and said, We need to talk about Virgil Marsh. He sat down across from her without a word, and she told him everything. Caleb did not move for a long time after she finished. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the ledger she had opened between them, and the lamp threw shadows across his face that made him look older than 35 and harder than stone. And Abigail let the silence sit, because she had learned already. 5 days was enough to learn this, that Caleb Whitmore needed space between the thing he heard and the thing he said. "The mill," he said finally. "Marsh Timber and Supply," she said. "I checked the original invoices against the current market rate. The markup started in the spring of 1880. 3 years of purchases. Fencing, lumber, feed, storage materials. Every invoice about 12% above what it should have been. 12%. Sometimes 14. She turned a page. "Your man was getting a cut. Whoever it was." "Hendricks," Caleb said. The name came out flat and final like a stone dropped into water. "The hand who left in April, his name was Hendricks." "Did you know him well?" "Thought I did." He looked down at the ledger. "He came with references, worked hard, never gave me reason." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "Or I wasn't looking for reasons." "You trusted him." "I did." His voice held no self-pity. Just the fact placed there the way he placed all facts, without ceremony, without excuse. "That was my mistake." "It wasn't your mistake," Abigail said. "It was his choice. There's a difference." He looked at her then, directly. It was the kind of look that arrived before a person was ready and stayed longer than was comfortable, and Abigail held it because looking away would have felt like flinching. "You said Marsh came to the property line," he said, "this afternoon, while you were out checking the south pasture. He knew your name." "He did." "And he offered you a better position. He suggested that information was worth more as a quiet thing." She folded her hands on the table. "He knew I'd found something, which means someone told him I was looking at the accounts." Caleb stood up from the table in one motion. Not fast, not with the performance of anger, but with the kind of deliberate energy that told her the stillness had cost him something, and he had just stopped paying it. "Hendricks," he said again. "Probably." She watched him move to the window. "Or someone Hendricks told before he left." "How much?" Caleb said. "Total. How much did they take?" She had spent 2 days preparing for this question. She had run the figures 4 different ways to make sure. "Across 3 years," she said, "roughly $460. The silence after that was a different kind than all the others. $460 in 1882 was not a number. It was land. It was livestock. It was the difference between a ranch that breathed and one that slowly, quietly stopped. "That's why," Caleb said. He did not turn from the window. "That's why the south fence needed full replacement last fall. I thought it was just age. I bought new materials, paid full price." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "For the second time." "Yes." "And the buyers who haven't paid. 3 of them. Combined, they owe you just over $200. I've drafted letters. They're on the desk in the front room when you want to look at them." She paused. "The accounts receivable is actually your clearest path forward. If you can collect what's already owed you, cover a significant portion of what Marsh and Hendricks took." He turned around then. He looked at the letters on the desk in the front room, which she could not see from where she sat, and then he looked at her. "You drafted them already." "I didn't send them. That's your decision." "When did you draft?" "Yesterday morning." He stared at her. "You've been here 5 days. The accounts weren't that complicated once I had the right framework." She looked down at the ledger. "They were designed to look complicated. That's not the same thing." He crossed back to the table and sat down again. Closer this time. He was looking at her he'd looked at the ranch from the wagon on the way in from town. Not with ownership, not with appetite, but with something quieter and more serious than either of those things. The look of a man taking true measure. "What do you need from me to finish the audit?" he said. "Access to any agreements you have with buyers. Written or verbal, whatever you remember. And any correspondence with the lumber yard going back to 1879 if you kept it." "I kept it." He said it without satisfaction. "I keep everything. Habit. Good habit. Hasn't helped me much. It's going to help you now." Something crossed his face at that. Brief. She almost missed it. But it was there, a fractional softening around the edges, the way a man looks when he is not expected to be helped and finds that he has been. "All right," he said. "I'll pull the files in the morning." "Tonight," she said. "If Marsh knows I've been in the accounts, he may try to move faster than we expect. I'd like to have the full picture before he does." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, went to the cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, and began pulling files. They worked until midnight. May found them there when she came down at 5 in the morning to start breakfast, the lamp still burning papers spread across the entire table surface, Abigail's careful handwriting, covering 3 new sheets, and Caleb sitting across from her with his elbows on the table and his eyes on a letter from 1879 that he had not read until tonight. May looked at the scene for exactly 1 second. Then she turned to the stove and said without expression, "I'll make a bigger pot." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "We found it," he said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man who has been awake all night confirming something he did not want confirmed. "The full amount," Abigail said. She had her pen down. She was watching his face. "The full picture." He set the letter down. Marsh bought out the original mill in 1879. Same year the prices started going up. The invoices have his signature on the supply end. He looked at the table. "I was paying Virgil Marsh directly, just didn't know it." "Because the mill changed hands and the name stayed the same," Abigail said. "Common enough that you wouldn't look twice." "I didn't look once." "You had no reason to. You trusted your man was checking it." "Hendricks was checking it all right." He pushed back from the table, straight into his own pocket. May set 2 cups of coffee on the table without being asked and went back to the stove. Abigail wrapped both hands around her cup and thought about Virgil Marsh on his horse at the property line yesterday, smiling that practiced smile saying, "Clever women know when information is worth more as a quiet thing." "He wants the ranch," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Not just the money," she said. "The money was secondary. He's been bleeding you slow enough that you wouldn't notice until you couldn't recover. And now that you're close to the edge, he shows up and offers what he hasn't come to you directly." "Not yet." Caleb's voice was very quiet. "He will." She looked at her notes. "The accounts receivable gives you time. If you can collect the outstanding debts before he moves, and if you can document the overcharging with the original invoices, you have grounds to go to the Territorial Land Office, maybe further." "Grounds aren't money." "No, but they're leverage, and right now leverage is what you need." He was quiet, looking at the paper. "You know the law around this," he said. "I know enough. I handled contract disputes at the school for 6 years. The principle isn't that different." She paused. "There's a land office in Laramie. I can write to them. Put together a formal complaint with the documentation. It won't resolve overnight, but it starts a record." She looked at him steadily. "A record is harder to make disappear than a verbal complaint." Caleb picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "You came here to apologize," he said, "for something that wasn't your fault." She did not answer immediately. "You stayed to do accounts," he said. "That's the job. You stayed up all night to find out how badly someone had stolen from me." He looked at her directly. "Miss Carter, why?" It was a fair question. She had been asking herself a version of it since midnight. "Because it's wrong," she said. "What Marsh did, what Hendricks did. It's wrong, and you worked for this ranch and you deserve to know the truth of it." She paused. "And because I'm good at this. It's maybe the one thing I am actually good at, and it seemed a waste not to use it." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "It's not the one thing." She did not know what to do with that. She looked down at her notes and told herself it was nothing, a man paying a compliment in a tired, honest moment. That was all nothing to build anything on. And the lamp burned low between them, and outside the Wyoming morning started without fanfare, the way mornings do. Pete was the one who told her about Eleanor Whitmore. He did not mean to. It came out the way things come out on a working ranch, when people are side by side doing necessary work, and the conversation goes somewhere before anyone decides to take it. They were repairing the main gate. Pete on the hinge side, Abigail holding the post brace steady, while Pete drove the bolts, and Pete was talking about the old days, the way he talked about everything in a wandering half-narration that went wherever it wanted. He talked about the winter of '78, which had been brutal. He talked about the cattle trail Caleb had run before he bought the ranch. He talked about the first year of the property, when everything had gone wrong at once, the way first years have a habit of doing, and how Caleb had just kept working, kept going, not because he was unafraid, but because stopping was worse. "He's always been like that," Pete said, torquing a bolt. "Works through, even after Eleanor." Abigail held the brace steady. Eleanor, his wife. Pete said it simply without looking up. Sweet woman, quiet. She loved this place. Caleb's brother too, Eli was his name. Eli came out to help with the South Pasture expansion, spring of '79. He stopped, set down the wrench, looked at the gate for a moment before he picked it up again. There was an accident. A section of new fence collapsed while they were working it. Eleanor was bringing out water. He shook his head very slightly. She and Eli both, same day. The air felt different after he said it. Not heavier exactly, just more honest. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "Caleb doesn't talk about it." Pete picked up the wrench again. "Doesn't mean he doesn't carry it." He glanced at her just briefly. "Just so you know, he ain't cold, Miss Abigail. He just put everything he felt somewhere deep and locked it up tight, and I reckon he forgot where he put the key." She thought about the column of careful figures in the third ledger that stopped in February of 1879, the handwriting that was precise and heartbreaking. She had not asked whose it was. Now she did not need to. She held the brace and said nothing, and Pete finished the bolts and the gate swung straight and true on its new hinges, and above them, the Wyoming sky was enormous and indifferent and beautiful. It was 12 days into her 30 that Marsh came to the front door. She answered it because Caleb was in the South Pasture, and May was in the kitchen, and Danny was God knows where, and there was no one else. She opened the door, and Marsh was standing there with his hat in his hand and his capable smile in full operation, and behind him were two men she didn't recognize, who were making no particular effort to look like anything other than what they were. "Miss Carter." Marsh's voice was warm. The warmth of it was deliberate and empty, like a fire built for show. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," she said. "Mr. Whitmore isn't in." "Yes, I know. I saw him ride out." He held her gaze. "I was hoping to speak with you." She did not step back from the doorway. "We said everything we needed to say at the property line." "I don't think we did." He tilted his head, the smile staying in place. "I've been thinking about our conversation. About what a clever woman in your position could do with the right opportunity." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "I'm prepared to offer you $50, right now, for the original invoices you pulled from the Whitmore files. $50, more than 6 months of her wages. Enough to start over somewhere clean and far from here." She was aware of what he was offering and what he knew about her position when he offered it. "No," she said. "Miss Carter." "Those invoices are evidence of fraud," she said. "Taking them would make me party to it, and I won't be." She looked at him steadily. "Now I'd like you to leave this property before Mr. Whitmore returns, and this conversation becomes something different." The smile did not leave his face, but it went somewhere colder underneath. "You're a long way from home," he said softly. "No family here. No real connection to Whitmore except a job that lasts 30 days. He let that sit for a moment. "A woman alone in Wyoming in 1882 needs friends more than she needs principles. I've got along fine on principles so far. You've been here 12 days. Long enough." She put her hand on the doorframe. "Good day, Mr. Marsh." She closed the door. She stood behind it with her heart hammering hard against her ribs and her hands completely still, because she had learned long ago that the hands were the first thing people looked at when they were deciding whether you were afraid, and she had never in her life allowed anyone to see that clearly into her. She heard him on the porch for a moment, then the sound of horses moving away. She let out a slow breath. Then she went to the desk, took out a clean sheet of paper, and wrote down everything that had just been said, exact words, exact time, exact description of the two men who had come with him, and dated it, and signed it, and put it in the locked drawer with the invoices. Evidence was only evidence if you recorded it. When Caleb came in at dusk and she handed him the paper, he read it twice. She watched his face, and it did not change the way faces change with anger. It went very still in the way that was. She was beginning to understand far more serious. "You didn't send for Pete," he said. "There wasn't time. You could have." "I handled it." She said it simply. "I'm telling you now so you know, not because I couldn't manage." He looked at the paper, then at her. "He offered you $50. Yes. And you said no." "Of course I said no." Something shifted in his expression, something that moved through and settled somewhere new. "That's 2 months' wages for you," he said quietly. "I know what it is." "You said no anyway." "Mr. Whitmore." She met his eyes. "I said no because what he's doing is wrong. Not because I'm loyal to you. Not because you're paying me. Because it's wrong, and I will not be part of it." She paused. "I want you to understand the difference." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "I understand it," he said. "Good." He set the paper down carefully on the desk. He put his hat on the hook by the door. He came back to the kitchen and got his coffee and stood by the window the way he stood when he was working something out. And then he turned around and said, "I'm going to Laramie." She blinked. "When?" "Day after tomorrow. I'll take the invoices, the complaint you drafted, and this paper." He nodded toward the account of Marsh's visit. "Land office will have to hear it. If they don't, there's a federal marshal who works the territory out of Laramie. I know him." "That's a 3-day ride." "Round trip, yes." She thought about the ranch without him, about Marsh knowing he was gone, about the two men who had stood behind Marsh on the porch with nothing particular in their expressions. "I'll go with you," she said. He stopped. "I know the documentation," she said before he could speak. "I built the case. If there are questions about the figures, I can answer them. You can't." She kept her voice even. "A land clerk isn't going to take your word on accounting details, but a bookkeeper who can walk him through every invoice, every discrepancy, with original documentation, that's different." He was quiet for a long moment. "It's a hard ride," he said. "I've ridden harder." He looked at her with that measuring look, the one she had started to recognize as the way he looked at things he was deciding whether to trust. "All right," he said. She nodded once. Then she went to start pulling the files they would need, and he stood in the kitchen doorway watching her work, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. So, they left before sunup. May had packed food and water without being asked, had pressed Abigail's hand once briefly when she handed over the saddlebag, and had said only, "You watch yourself out there," in a tone that covered considerably more than trail safety. Danny stood in the yard to see them off with a look that was equal parts admiration and worry, and carefully said nothing. Pete just raised his hand from the barn doorway. The road to Laramie was long and mostly silence, and Abigail found that she did not mind. She was a capable rider. Her father had seen to that back in Missouri, back when there had been a father and a Missouri that felt like home, and the landscape around her was the kind of enormous that made personal problems feel correctly sized. Not small, just proportionate. Caleb rode slightly ahead, the way he did everything, not because he was leading, but because he was watching. Always watching, the habit of a man who had learned that the thing that hurts you is usually the thing you weren't paying attention to. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek crossing. Abigail sat on a flat rock and ate the biscuits. May had packed and looked at the water and thought about Marsh's face when she had closed the door. The confidence underneath the smile. The certainty of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "He'll do something while we're gone," she said. Caleb crouched by the water hat in his hand. "Probably. Pete knows to keep the files locked. Told him last night. And May's handled worse than Virgil Marsh." He glanced at her. "She was here before I was. Came with the property near enough. Nothing gets past her that she doesn't decide to let pass." Abigail filed that away. Then she said, "Tell me about the federal marshal. The one in Laramie." Harding. Caleb sat back on his heels, turned the hat in his hands. Known him 8 years. Good man, straight. He doesn't move fast, but he moves right, which matters more. He paused. He knew Eleanor. She did not look at him. She watched the water. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife and your brother." She kept her voice even. "Pete told me. I hope that's all right." The silence stretched. "It's all right," he said. "You don't have to talk about it." "I know." Another silence. The horses drank. The creek ran over its stones with the complete indifference of moving water. "Eli was 22, Caleb said. "He came out because I asked him. The expansion was too much work for one crew, and he wanted to learn ranching, and I wanted—" He stopped. "I wanted my brother near me, that was all. Just wanted him near." He was still watching the water. Eleanor brought out water because she always did. Because she was the kind of woman who thought about whether the men working had enough to drink. He turned the hat in his hands again. The section gave out without warning. Supports weren't set right. My fault. I'd been pushing too fast to get ahead of the season. "It wasn't your fault," Abigail said. "I know what you mean when you say that. It's still true." He put his hat back on. He stood up. He looked at the road ahead, the way he looked at the ledgers steadily without flinching, taking the measure of what was there. "I stopped trusting people after," he said. "Not on purpose, just I stopped." He did not look at her when he said it. He said it the way a man reports a fact about weather or terrain. Easier to trust the work. Work does what it does, and you know what you're getting. "People aren't much different," she said. "Most of them do what they do, and if you watch carefully, you can see what you're getting." He looked at her then. "You're not what I was getting," he said. She stood up from the rock, brushed the biscuit crumbs from her skirt, looked at the road ahead. "You're getting someone who found your accounts in a mess and fixed them," she said. "And someone who wouldn't take $50 to let you get robbed." She picked up her saddlebag. "That seems like a fair trade for 30 days and a train ticket home." He was quiet for a moment. "It's more than that," he said. She did not answer. She went to her horse, but her hands were not completely steady when she gathered the reins, and she made sure he was looking at the road before she let herself know that. They reached Laramie on the afternoon of the second day. The land office was a narrow building on a side street that smelled of ink and old paper and the specific institutional patience of government offices everywhere. The clerk was a young man named Aldous, who had the organized energy of someone who took his work seriously and had not yet been disappointed by it enough times to stop. Abigail set the documentation on his desk. Then she walked him through it. She had done this before. Contract disputes, lease disagreements, supplier irregularities, and she knew the particular language that landed in places like this. Specific. Numbered. Cross-referenced. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for sympathy. She laid the evidence in a clean line from the mill acquisition in 1879 to the last overcharged invoice in April of 1882. With the amounts, the dates, the signatures, and the pattern that connected them into something that was no longer a series of coincidences. Aldous took notes. He asked questions. She answered them. Caleb sat beside her and said almost nothing, and the one time Aldous looked at him for confirmation, Caleb said, "She knows the numbers better than I do. Ask her." At the end of an hour, Aldous set down his pen and looked at the documentation spread across his desk and said, "I'm going to need copies of these." "I brought copies," Abigail said, and set them on the right side of the stack. "The originals stay with Mr. Whitmore." Aldous blinked. Then he almost smiled. "You've done this before." "Yes," she said. They found Marshall Harding at the hotel restaurant that evening. He was a broad, unhurried man with gray at his temples and the specific stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was more useful than speed in most situations. He stood when they came in, shook Caleb's hand with genuine warmth, looked at Abigail with professional appraisal and said, "Caleb says you built the case. Tell me about it." So she told him. He listened the way Caleb listened, fully without interrupting, letting her finish before he spoke. When she was done, he sat back and looked at his coffee and said, Marsh has been operating in this territory for 7 years. He's careful. He doesn't leave things that look like crimes, just things that look like business. He left these, Abigail said, and put the invoices on the table. Harding looked at them. He came to the property, she said. Offered me $50 for the originals. I have a written account of the conversation signed and dated. Harding looked at her over the invoices. You wrote it down right after, he said. Yes. Smart. It seemed necessary. He looked at Caleb. She always liked this. Caleb considered for a moment. Pretty much. Harding picked up the invoices. He looked at them for a long time with the attention of a man who was building a case in real time, fitting pieces together in an order that would hold. I can't move on this tonight, he said. I need to make some inquiries. Talk to the land office. There may be other properties. Marsh is the kind of man who doesn't just do one thing. He set the invoices down. Can you stay in Laramie 2 more days? Abigail looked at Caleb. We'll stay, Caleb said. Harding nodded. He stood. Then he looked at Abigail again. Not the professional appraisal this time, something more direct. Miss Carter, he said. You came here to stand up for a man you've known 12 days, against a man with money and connections and 2 large friends. He paused. Why? She met his gaze. She thought about what she had told Caleb the night of the accounts. She thought about what she had said to Marsh at the door. Because it's right, she said. And because the truth in those documents belongs to Mr. Whitmore, not to Marsh, not to me. She folded her hands on the table. I just made sure it got where it was supposed to go. Harding looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the respect of a man who has learned the hard way to recognize the real thing when it sits down across from him. 2 days, he said. I'll find you. He left. The restaurant settled back into its ordinary noise around them. Abigail looked at the table and felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has held a great deal of tension in a very short time and has just been told it will be 2 more days before they can put it down. Caleb was quiet beside her. Then he said, You're tired. I'm fine. You've been fine for 12 days straight. He did not say it unkindly. You're allowed to be tired. She looked at him. He was watching her with that measuring look again, except it was not measuring anymore. It was something else. Something that had moved past the accounting of who she was and arrived at something it had not named yet. Thank you, he said, for what you just did in there, and in the land office, and at the door when Marsh came. He said it quietly without ceremony. I don't say it enough. I know that. You don't need to say it. I want to. She looked at the table. She was aware of the 2 days still ahead, and the ranch behind them, and Marsh somewhere between the two, and all the things that were not yet resolved, and would not be for some time. She was aware of 12 days of work, and a question she had not let herself ask yet about what came after 30. All right, she said. You're welcome. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing she had seen to a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, brief and real there and gone. Get some rest, he said. I'll see you in the morning. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight and thought about all of it. The accounts, the invoices. Harding's eyes across the table, the almost smile at the corner of Caleb Whitmore's mouth, and she thought 18 days left on this contract. Then she lay down and slept harder than she had in 6 years. And in the morning, everything changed. She woke to the sound of boots in the hallway, too fast, too purposeful for ordinary morning, and then a knock at her door. That was Caleb's knock. She already knew it, and she said yes, before she was fully awake. Harding sent word, he said through the door. His voice was controlled and level, and underneath that control was something she recognized as the sound of a man holding himself very carefully together. There's been a fire at the ranch. She was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. Caleb was already in the hallway, hat on, jaw set, moving toward the stairs with the deliberate speed of a man who has decided that running is slower than walking with complete intention. Abigail fell into step beside him without discussion, because there was nothing to discuss. The ranch was burning, and they were here, and every minute between them and home was a minute that cost something irreplaceable. "How bad?" she said. "Harding's man didn't know. Said a rider came in from the Red Rock direction an hour before dawn. Word got to Harding, and he sent straight to us. He was already at the bottom of the stairs. That's all I have." Pete and Danny were at the property. Yes. May. Yes. She did not ask anything else. She followed him out into the gray pre-dawn of Laramie, and did not let herself think about what yes meant until she knew more, because thinking about it before she knew would use up something she might need later. Marshal Harding was waiting for them at the stable. He was already dressed, already armed, already wearing the particular expression of a man who has been given bad information and is angry about what it implies. "Ryder says it was the feed barn," Harding said, moving to meet them. "Not the house. The barn caught first. Whether it spread is what I don't know." "How long ago did the rider leave Red Rock?" Caleb said. 3 hours, maybe more. He came hard." 3 hours. Abigail did her counting without being asked. 2 hours back to the ranch at speed. That meant whatever was happening had been happening for 5 hours before they would see it with their own eyes. "Who sent the rider?" she said. Harding looked at her. "Pete Callahan." She let out a breath she had been holding since the knock on the door. Pete had sent word. Pete was alive enough to send word. That was something. That was a significant something. "I'm coming with you," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You need someone who knows what was in that barn," she said. "The supply inventory, the hay count, the equipment list. For any insurance claim, any legal filing, any accounting of loss, you need someone who can document what was there and what's gone." She held his gaze. "That's me." He didn't argue. He just said, "Ride fast," and turned to get the horses. Harding rode with them. He brought one deputy, a quiet young man named Reeves, who said nothing and kept pace well, and they moved out of Laramie as the first real light was breaking over the eastern hills. 4 horses at a hard run on a road that Abigail had only seen once before, but that her horse seemed to know better than she did, and she kept her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins, and did not think about the fire, did not imagine it. Held herself in the present moment of road and speed and the sound of hooves on dry ground, because the present moment was something she could manage. The smell reached them before the ranch was in sight. Not fire anymore. The aftermath of the particular heaviness of wet ash and scorched wood that settles into the air and stays there for days, layered over everything, getting into the back of the throat. Abigail knew that smell. She had known it once before in Missouri, when the school's storage building had caught in a dry August. It was the smell of something that had been whole and was not anymore. Caleb's hands did not change on the reins, but his shoulders did something, a tightening, a holding, the physical posture of a man preparing to absorb. She wanted to say something. She could not find the right words, and the wrong ones would have been worse than silence. So she said nothing and kept pace, and they rode into the yard together. The feed barn was gone. The frame was standing, or most of it, the bones of it blackened and skeletal and wrong, but the walls and roof had come down, and what remained was a collapsed ruin with smoke still rising from certain points in the debris, like the building was still deciding whether it was finished. The ground around it was soaked from bucket lines, and the air was thick with the smell, and everything in the immediate vicinity had the stunned, flattened quality of the morning after a disaster. Pete was at the water trough. He turned when he heard the horses, and his face when he saw Caleb had several things in it at once, relief and exhaustion, and something harder underneath that Abigail could not immediately identify. "Thank God," Pete said. "Both of you, thank God." Caleb was off his horse before it fully stopped. He crossed to Pete in 4 strides and gripped the older man's shoulder and said, "What happened? Start from the beginning." "Around midnight," Pete said. He was horse smoke or shouting or both. Danny smelled it first. He was doing the late check. By the time we got out there, the east wall was already going. He coughed once, cleared his throat. "We got the horses out. Got May out of the house and back from the Sparks. Danny and me and the Hendersons from the next property. They saw the light and came over. We ran bucket lines for 2 hours before it stopped spreading. The house, untouched, came close on the north corner, but we got ahead of it. The cattle, all accounted for. We moved them to the south pasture before it jumped." Caleb let out a breath. One slow, controlled breath. Then he said, "How did it start?" Pete's face. Did the thing that Abigail had been watching for since she got off her horse. The thing she had seen coming from the moment she heard 3 hours, and Pete sent word and put together in her mind what those things meant in combination. Lantern, Pete said. East wall low down, the way it caught. He looked at Caleb directly. Cal, a lantern doesn't fall by itself and catch low on an exterior wall. Not unless it was set there. The yard went very quiet. Harding, who had dismounted behind them, said, "You see anyone on the property?" "No, sir." Pete turned to the marshal. "But Danny found boot tracks on the east side this morning when the ground was still soft from the bucket water. 2 sets. Came from the tree line, went back the same way." "You touched them?" "No, sir." "Sir, figured you'd want to see." Harding looked at Reeves. Reeves was already moving toward the east side of the barn without being told. Harding followed. And Abigail stood in the yard between Caleb and Pete and looked at the wreckage of the feed barn and thought about Virgil Marsh, thought about his face at the property line. A woman alone in Wyoming needs friends more than she needs principles. Thought about the 2 men behind him on the porch, the ones who had made no particular effort to look like anything other than what they were. Thought about the way he had said $50 not as a genuine offer, but as a test, a measure of what she would do when pushed. She had closed the door, and now the barn was ash. "He knew we'd gone to Laramie," she said. Caleb looked at her. "He knew we'd gone, and he knew why, and he knew this was the window." She kept her voice even, not because she was calm, because being even was what the moment needed. "This wasn't random. This was a message. Or an attempt to destroy something," Pete said quietly. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" Pete reached into his shirt pocket. He took out a folded piece of paper, slightly damp at one corner, and held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it. It was a contract. Not hers, not Caleb's. A land sale agreement, pre-written, the blank lines already filled in with the property description of Whitmore Ranch, the acreage figures, the value assessment. At the bottom, on the seller's signature line, was a name already printed, Caleb J. Whitmore. The buyer's name was Virgil Marsh. The date on the document was 2 weeks from today. "Where did you find this?" she said. "Tacked to the barn door," Pete said. "Before it caught. Danny grabbed it when we ran the bucket line because it seemed like the kind of thing you grab." He looked at Caleb. "I think Marsh figured if he burned you bad enough you'd sign." Abigail read the contract again. All of it. Every clause, every condition, every piece of careful language that had been written by someone who knew what they were doing. A lawyer, most likely someone Marsh paid to make things look legitimate before they were. The price was insultingly low. Less than a third of what the property was worth based on the accounts she had reconstructed. It would cover the debts and leave Caleb with barely enough to start over somewhere smaller. It was the price you offered a man when you had spent 3 years making sure he had no other options. "He planned this," she said. "Not just the fire, all of it. The overcharging, Hendricks, the buyer accounts he let go unpaid." She stopped, looked up. "The buyers who owe you. Did you ever try to collect directly before I got here?" Caleb frowned. "Sent letters. And nothing came back, because Marsh intercepted them." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has just fit the last piece into a shape that was always there. Or someone in town did it for him. "You've been cut off at every angle for 3 years. He starved the ranch, and now he's offering you a lifeboat at his price." She set the contract on the water trough. "He thought you'd come back from Laramie with nothing, and find this, and have no choice." "He didn't know what you had," Pete said, looking at her. "No," she said. "He didn't." Caleb picked up the contract. He read it through once. Then he folded it in half and put it in his vest pocket and looked at the barn. "How much did we lose?" he said. "In real numbers." She was already calculating. "The hay inventory approximately 40% of winter stores. The equipment stored in the east half, I'll need to get a list from Danny. The structure itself, rebuild cost." She paused. "I'll need paper." "May has paper." She started toward the house. Then she stopped and turned back. "Caleb." She waited until he looked at her. The contract is dated 2 weeks out. That means he expected you to sign before then, which means he's moving on a timeline. She held his gaze. We have to move faster. He looked at her for a moment. That look again, measuring, settling, arriving somewhere. I know, he said. She went to find May and paper and a pen, and behind her, she heard Harding's voice calling from the east side of the barn, and Reeves answering, and the ranch breathing around all of them in the smoke-thick morning like something alive and stubborn and not finished yet. Not finished yet. That was what she held on to as she sat at May's kitchen table and started the loss inventory. Not finished. May put coffee in front of her without speaking. Then May sat down across from her and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a woman who has watched a lot of things happen on this land and has learned to read them clearly. You all right? May said. Yes. You sure? Abigail set down her pen. She looked at her hands, still steady, the way she had trained them to be, and thought about all the things that were not all right and that she was not going to say right now because this was not the moment. He burned it on purpose, she said. To frighten us. To make Caleb feel like he had no options. I know, May said. It's not going to work. May looked at her for a moment. Then she reached across the table and patted Abigail's hand once the way a person pats something they believe in. No, May said. It's not. Harding came to the house at mid-morning with the news that the boot tracks pointed back to a property south of the tree line that Marsh had purchased 3 years ago. A small parcel, mostly scrubland, not worth anything on its own, but positioned. Harding noted as a very convenient staging area between Marsh's main holdings and the Whitmore ranch. I can't prove Marsh ordered it, Harding said. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Caleb and Abigail and a map he had spread between the coffee cups. Not yet, but I can prove those 2 men were on your property, and I can prove they came from land Marsh controls. He looked at Abigail. The contract you found, that's a document I want to look at very carefully. She slid it across the table. He read it in silence. His expression did not change, but she watched his eyes, and his eyes said something she recognized. This lawyer, he said. The firm named here for the drafting. He tapped the bottom of the page. I know this firm. They handled a similar transaction 2 years ago. A family north of Cheyenne, small operation burned out. Signed under duress. The land went to Marsh 3 days later. He set the contract down. I couldn't prove anything then. I've been looking for the thread ever since. The kitchen was very quiet. This is the thread, Abigail said. It might be. Harding looked at Caleb. I need more time. I need to get word to the territorial office in Cheyenne, and I need you to not sign anything and not do anything that gives Marsh grounds to come at you legally. He paused. Can you hold on? The hay inventory is at 60% of what it needs to be for winter, Abigail said. The rebuild will cost, she looked at her figures, $90 minimum for the materials alone, assuming we do the labor ourselves. She looked at Harding. The outstanding buyer debts cover it if we can collect. But we need those payments to move. Send the letters today, Harding said. All 3 buyers. I'll have Reeves carry them personally, official hand delivery with my name on the covering envelope. They'll pay. Caleb looked at him. Trust me, Harding said. My name on an envelope changes how fast people find their checkbooks. The letters went out by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Abigail had a complete loss inventory, a rebuild estimate, and a revised account of the ranch's financial position that was against every reasonable expectation, not catastrophic. Damaged. Set back. But not catastrophic. The bones were still good. The cattle were still in the south pasture. The house was still standing, and so was the equipment in the west half of the barn, and so were Pete and Danny and May, and every single thing that could not be replaced by money. She was going over the figures for the 3rd time, when Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and his expression carrying news. There's a rider, he said. From town. Says he's got a message for Mr. Whitmore from Marsh. The kitchen went still. Caleb was on his feet. Where is he? Out front. Didn't want to come to the door. Said he'd wait. Caleb looked at Harding, who was still at the table. Harding nodded very slightly. Caleb picked up his hat and went out. Abigail followed. The writer was young, barely 20, with the look of someone who had been given a job and told not to ask what was in the envelope. He held out the letter when Caleb reached him, said, "Mr. Marsh asked me to deliver this personal," and looked immediately like he would prefer to be elsewhere. Caleb took the envelope. He did not open it there. He looked at the writer and said, "You can go." The writer went. Fast. Caleb came back inside. He opened the envelope at the kitchen table with Harding and Abigail watching. It was short. Marsh did not waste words when he thought he had already won. "Mr. Whitmore, I trust last night has clarified your situation. My offer stands at the price previously indicated. I am prepared to complete the transaction at your convenience, not to exceed 2 weeks from today's date. I suggest you take this opportunity seriously. Further difficulties on your property would be regrettable. V. Marsh. Further difficulties." Abigail read it twice. "He's threatening more," she said. "He's confirming he did the first one," Harding said. He said it quietly and with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just been given exactly what he needed. He picked up the letter carefully by the edge. "This goes with me to Cheyenne. He just put in writing that he has the means and intention to continue damaging your property if you don't sell." He looked at Caleb. "That's extortion. That's federal territory." Caleb sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Abigail. "You knew," he said. "When you got Marsh to come to the door, when you closed it on him, you knew he'd escalate." She had known it was possible. She had not known it would be the barn. "I knew he'd show his hand," she said carefully. "I didn't know what he'd do." "But you kept the record." "Yes. Because you knew it would matter. Evidence only matters if you have it," she said. "I didn't know what form it would take. I just knew to write it down." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she had not seen before, not the measuring look, not the stillness, not the controlled management of a man who kept everything contained. Something that had come up through all of that and was looking at her from underneath it unguarded for just a moment. Abigail, he said. She went very still inside. "If you'd taken Marsh's $50. I didn't. I know you didn't, but if you had." He did not look away. "You'd be somewhere safe right now. Away from this. Away from a burned barn and a man who threatens in writing and all of it." He paused. "Nobody would have blamed you." "I would have," she said. "I know." His voice was very quiet. "That's what I'm trying to say." She did not know how to answer that. She looked at the table, at the figures, the inventory, the recovered invoices, the copy of Marsh's letter that Harding was now folding into his vest pocket, and she thought about 30 days and train fare home, and the moment she had said $8, and he had said $8, and something had started that neither of them had named. "There's still work to do," she said. "There always is." "Then we should get back to it." He almost smiled again. That same brief real thing at the corner of his mouth there and gone. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The first payment came back in 4 days. Harding's deputy had hand-delivered the first letter to a buyer named Corbin, who ran a mid-sized cattle operation 2 days east, and who, upon receiving an accounts receivable letter with a federal marshal's name on the covering envelope, had apparently experienced a sudden and thorough recollection of the debt he owed and sent a bank draft by return rider. $87. Abigail held the draft in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to find Caleb. He was at the south fence doing the repair work himself, because Danny was on the barn rebuild, and Pete's shoulder had gone wrong from the bucket lines, and there was nobody else. He was working in silence in the afternoon heat, driving posts, with the focused economy of a man who knows the work and does not need to think about it anymore. She held up the draft when he turned. He looked at it. He looked at her. "First one," she said. He set down the post driver. He took the draft. He read the amount. $87, he said. "Yes." "The hay replacement costs $72. "I know." He looked at the draft for another moment. Then he looked at her and something shifted, something that had been holding very tight for a very long time, and it was not relief exactly, and it was not joy exactly, but it was something real and human and closer to both of those things than anything she had seen on his face before. "We're going to be all right," he said. Not a question. "We're going to be all right," she said. A fact. He handed the draft back. His fingers brushed hers for a moment, an accident, or close enough to one that neither of them addressed it, and he picked up the post driver and went back to the fence, and she went back to the house, and the afternoon opened up around the ranch like something breathing. It was May who noticed first. Of course it was May. That evening at supper, May looked across the table from Caleb to Abigail and back again with the expression of a woman watching a thing develop at its own pace and choosing for now to say nothing about it. Pete was talking about the south fence and Danny was talking about the barn timber, and May looked at both of them and said nothing and passed the biscuits. After supper, Abigail was clearing the table when May said quietly from the stove, "He laughed today." Abigail stopped. "While you were in with the accounts," May said. She was not looking at Abigail. She was looking at the pot she was cleaning. Pete said something foolish, and Caleb laughed. She paused. "I haven't heard that in 3 years." Abigail did not know what to say. "I'm not telling you that to put something on you," May said. "I'm telling you because you should know what's happening in this house, and because—" She stopped, looked up. "Because you deserve to know you're doing something good here, even if it scares you." Abigail set down the plates. "It does scare me," she said. "I know. I have 18 days left on the contract." "I know that too." They looked at each other across the kitchen. Two women in a house in Wyoming in 1882, one of whom had been here long enough to see what this place could be, and one of whom was still deciding whether she was allowed to want it. "He hasn't asked me to stay," Abigail said. "No," May said. "He hasn't." She turned back to the stove. "But he hasn't been counting the days either. And with Caleb Whitmore, what a man doesn't say tells you more than what he does." The second payment came on day 17. The third came on day 19 with a note of apology from the buyer that Abigail suspected had been suggested by Harding's deputy in the same tone that made people find their checkbooks fast. Combined with the first payment they covered the hay replacement, the barn rebuild materials, 3 months of forward operating costs, and left a surplus that Abigail had not calculated for because she had not let herself plan that far. She went over the figures 4 times before she believed them. Then she sat in the kitchen with the ledger open in front of her and thought the ranch is solvent. Not comfortable, not wealthy, not what it could have been if Marsh hadn't spent 3 years bleeding it. But solvent. Standing. The bones were good. She had always been able to see that. Caleb found her there at midnight, same as the first night. Same lamp burning low. Different numbers on the page. Better numbers that meant something different now. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her and said nothing. She looked up. "It's done," she said. "The accounts, all of it. You have everything you need for the legal filing, everything for Harding, and your ranch is in the black." She paused. "For the first time in 3 years, I think. At least since the spring of 1880, by what I can tell." He did not move from the doorway. 11 days left," he said. She looked down at the ledger. "Yes. Harding says it could be another month before Cheyenne moves on Marsh." "That's likely. The barn rebuild will take 2 weeks minimum." "I know. I wrote the schedule." He was quiet. She could feel him looking at her, and she kept her eyes on the page because looking up felt like a decision she had not made yet. "I don't have grounds to ask you to stay past 30 days, he said. "The contract is the contract. I'll have your fare ready on the day." "All right," she said. Another silence. "But I want you to know," he said, "that this place, what you did for it, what you found, what you built back." He stopped, started again. "I would not have seen it. Not without you. I was too close to it. I'd stopped looking because I'd stopped—" He paused. "I'd stopped believing it was worth looking." She looked up then. She had not meant to, but she did. Howe was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and his face was open in a way she had not seen it before, not unguarded exactly, but no longer guarded in the old way. The way of a man who has been keeping something at a great distance and has recently noticed that it is no longer that far away. Abigail, he said. Yes, she said before she knew what she was saying yes to. Stay. Just that. One word. Quiet as everything else, he said. No performance. No promises about what it would mean or what would come after. Just the word placed between them like the first honest thing either of them had said about this. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Missouri. About $3. About a name that wasn't hers, and a train that had carried her somewhere she hadn't expected to be anything at all. She thought about $87 and a laugh she hadn't heard, and a hand on a gate, and a man who said that's enough to start, and meant it. She thought about 18 days and what it felt like when they ended. I'll stay through this barn, rebuild, she said carefully. 6 weeks. Something in his face, a brightness brief and real there before he could stop it. 6 weeks, he said, and we renegotiate after that. Fair enough. She looked back down at the ledger. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. He did not move for a moment. Then, good night, Abigail. She heard him cross the kitchen, heard him stop at the door. The figures, he said. On the last page, the surplus column. Yes. You didn't have to do that, project that far forward. That was beyond the job. She kept her eyes on the page. I wanted to see the shape of what it could be. He was quiet for a moment. So did I, he said. Then he was gone, and the house settled, and the lamp burned, and outside Wyoming was enormous and full of stars, and somewhere in the distance from the south pasture, where the cattle moved in the dark, a sound rose and fell and rose again, ordinary and steady and alive. 11 days left on the original contract. 6 more weeks after that, and somewhere beyond the reach of her careful planning, something neither of them had named yet, was quietly, patiently building itself out of honesty and hard work, and the kind of time that cannot be rushed. But she did not know yet what Marsh had left in motion. She did not know what was already riding toward the ranch, and she would not know until morning came, and with it a face she had never expected to see again in her life. She heard the wagon before she saw it. She was at the kitchen table with the barn rebuild schedule, when the sound of wheels on the dry road reached her, and something in the rhythm of it too, deliberate, too measured for a supply run or a casual visit, made her set down her pen. She went to the window, not because she expected anything in particular, but because 23 days on a working ranch had trained her to pay attention to things that arrived without announcement. The wagon came through the gate and stopped in the yard, and Clara Carter stepped down from it. Abigail stood at the window and did not move for a full 3 seconds. Her sister looked exactly as she always had composed. Pretty, wearing a traveling dress that was better than anything Abigail owned, carrying herself with the particular ease of a woman who had never in her life arrived somewhere and worried about whether she would be welcome. Clara looked around the yard with the assessing eyes of someone taking inventory. Saw Pete coming out of the half-rebuilt barn, said something to him that Abigail could not hear through the glass, and then looked at the house. Their eyes met through the window. Clara smiled. Abigail went to the door. She did not run. She walked at the pace of a woman who has had 3 seconds to decide how she feels about something and has chosen for the moment not to feel it at all. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch and said, "Clara." "Abby." Clara came across the yard with her arms already open. "Oh, Abby, look at you. You look different. What are you doing here?" Abigail said. She did not step into the embrace. She stood at the top of the porch steps with her hands at her sides and her voice even. "You're supposed to be in Boston." Clara's arms came down slowly. She read Abigail's face with the practiced speed of a younger sister who had spent a lifetime reading it. Something shifted in her expression, not guilt exactly. Something adjacent to it that had not quite made the full journey. "Thomas and I—" She stopped. "It didn't work out." "I see." "I'm sorry, Abby. I know I left you in a terrible—" "You sent me 500 miles under your name," Abigail said, "to meet a man you'd committed to and then abandoned, with $3 and no position waiting at home." She kept her voice very level. "I want you to understand that I know exactly what you did." Clara was quiet for a moment. Her eyes went to the yard, the barn frame, the house, taking in the whole of it with the expression of someone revising a calculation. You stayed, she said. I stayed. And the man Whitmore, he let you. He hired me. Abigail looked at her sister. As a bookkeeper. Because I'm good at that. Because someone needed to be. Clara was quiet again longer this time. The assessing look settled into something that might have been genuine surprise. You're not angry, Clara said. I'm very angry, Abigail said. I'm just not doing it right now because there are other things that matter more. She stepped back from the doorway. Come inside. I'll put coffee on, and you'll tell me everything from the beginning, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Clara came up the steps. She paused beside Abigail and looked at her. Really looked the way people rarely bother to, and said quietly, You're different. Yes, Abigail said. I am. She went inside to put the coffee on, and Clara followed, and the door closed behind them both. The full story came out over an hour and 2 cups of coffee, and one moment where Clara cried briefly, and Abigail handed her a handkerchief and waited without comment. Thomas from Boston had been real charming. Attentive everything Clara described until 3 weeks after they arrived in Boston, and it became clear that his affections were considerably less fixed than he had represented. He had a fiancée in Connecticut. He had been in the language Clara used with a bitterness that was the most honest thing Abigail had heard from her in years, a very good liar. Clara had spent 2 weeks in Boston with no money and no connections, and the specific humiliation of a woman who has burned her options for someone who turned out not to deserve them. Then she had written to their aunt in Kansas City. Their aunt had wired her enough money to travel. Clara had come west instead of home, because, and here she paused, looking at her coffee cup, because she had known what she'd done to Abigail, and she could not face going home without facing it first. And the address, Abigail said. You had it from the letters. Yes. So you came to Wyoming? Yes. Clara looked up. Abby, I know I don't have the right to ask for... Stop. Abigail set down her cup. I don't want an apology yet. I want to know one thing. She looked at her sister directly. Did you know when you sent me what the situation here was? Did you know the ranch was struggling? I didn't know anything about the ranch. I only knew he was a rancher who wanted a wife, and he wrote decent letters. You didn't think about what would happen to me when I got there. Clara's jaw tightened. Not defensively tightly the way a person's jaw tightens when they are holding themselves accountable for something, and it costs them. No, she said. I didn't think about you at all. She said it quietly. That's the truth, Abby. I thought about what I wanted, and then I stopped thinking. She looked at her hands. I've always done that, and you've always been the one who cleaned up after it. The kitchen was quiet. It was the most honest thing Clara had said to her in years, possibly ever. Abigail picked up her coffee. She looked at the ledger still open on the table, the figures she'd been working when the wagon came in, and thought about 30 days and 6 weeks and a conversation at midnight, and a man who had said, stay in a voice that was not a request. You can have the parlor room for now, she said. May will show you. You'll help with the housework while you're here. May doesn't need another person to look after she needs another pair of hands. Clara blinked. I can, and you'll stay out of the accounts. Abigail met her eyes. This ranch has had enough people in its finances who didn't know what they were doing. That's my work. You won't touch it. Of course. And Clara. She waited until her sister was fully looking at her. When you meet Caleb Whitmore, you will not for one moment try to be charming. You will not try to be useful in the way you are useful when you want something. You will be honest. Straightforwardly, plainly honest. Do you understand me? Clara stared at her. Abby. Do you understand me? A pause. Then quietly, yes. Good. Abigail stood and picked up the ledger. Come on. I'll introduce you to May. Tete. Caleb came in at midday. He saw the unfamiliar wagon in the yard, and his face asked the question before he reached the kitchen door. Abigail was already there. My sister, she said. Clara, she arrived this morning. She looked at him steadily. She's staying in the parlor room for now. I should have asked you first. I'll understand if... Is she trouble? He said. A fair question. She considered it honestly. She was, she said. She's trying not to be. He looked at her for a moment. You all right? Yes. Sure. She looked at him. It occurred to her that 3 weeks ago, she would not have known what to do with that question. The simplicity of it, the directness, the fact that it was asked at all. She had spent 27 years being the one who managed things and the one who was not asked. I'm sure, she said. He nodded. He came inside. May introduced him to Clara with the expression of a woman managing something she has opinions about and has decided to observe before voicing them. Clara was to her credit exactly as Abigail had asked, plain direct no performance. She looked Caleb in the eye and said, I owe you and my sister an apology, Mr. Whitmore. I intend to earn the right to give one properly. For now, I'll just say that Abigail is the better of us by a considerable distance, and I'm glad she ended up somewhere that recognized it. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at the ledger. Lunch is ready, May said firmly, and that was the end of that. It was Pete who came to find her that afternoon, and the look on his face was the kind that arrives before news that has not yet decided how bad it is. Rider from town, he said. Brought a message for you. Not for Caleb. You specifically. She took the envelope. Her name on the outside, Miss Abigail Carter, not Miss Clara Carter, which told her that whoever had sent it knew exactly who she was and had known for some time. She opened it. The handwriting was neat, slanted, the kind of controlled script that belonged to someone educated and careful. The message was short. Miss Carter, I have information material to the case against Virgil Marsh that I believe you are the right person to receive. I am not able to go to the marshal directly. I will be at the Red Rock Church on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. I ask that you come alone. A friend. She read it twice. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She looked at Pete. Who brought this? Young boy. Didn't know him. Said a man in town paid him a nickel to deliver it. Description of the man. Pete's eyes sharpened. He had worked enough years on a ranch run by a cautious man to recognize a cautious question. Short, dark coat. Wouldn't look the boy in the eye. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket. Don't tell Caleb yet, she said. Pete looked at her. I'll tell him, she said. I'm not keeping it from him, but I want to think first. She looked at Pete directly. I've learned that information is only useful when you know what to do with it. Give me an hour. Pete looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. 1 hour, Miss Abigail. She went to the kitchen table with the letter and a clean sheet of paper, and she thought. The letter could be genuine. Someone inside Marsh's operation, a clerk, a hand, a lawyer who had developed a conscience, could be trying to come forward without exposing themselves directly. That happened. She had seen it in contract disputes in Missouri, the person who knew the truth and was afraid to say it in open daylight. The letter could be a trap. Marsh had tried money. He had tried fire. A woman alone at a church on a Thursday evening was a different kind of vulnerable than a woman in a locked house with ranch hands in earshot. She picked up her pen and wrote down both possibilities. Then she wrote a third. The letter could be both a genuine informant being used by Marsh without knowing it, a real person with real information being set up as bait for something larger. She looked at what she had written. Then she went to find Caleb. He did not react the way she expected. She had expected the immediate refusal. You're not going alone. You're not going at all. This is clearly a trap. She was prepared for that. She had her counter-arguments ready. What he did was take the letter, read it once, set it on the table, and say, Thursday is 2 days from now. Yes. Harding is still in Laramie. We could send for him. Takes a day. He looked at the letter. He could be here by Thursday noon. She had not thought of that. She had been so focused on the binary of go or not go that she had not backed up far enough to see the larger board. If we bring Harding, she said slowly, we can't tell him I was asked to come alone. He won't allow it. No. Caleb looked at her. But if someone's trying to set a trap, Harding in town is a different problem for them than Harding in Laramie. He paused. And if the informant is real, Harding's presence nearby, not inside the church but nearby, gives them better protection once they've spoken. She looked at him. "You've thought about this kind of thing before," she said. "Cattle country has land disputes," he said simply. "You learn to think around corners." "You want me to go. I want you to be safe." He said it without elaboration, without looking away. "Those aren't the same thing as not going." He picked up the letter again. "You said yourself a woman who won't take $50 and won't back down from a door is useful. But useful doesn't mean alone." She absorbed that. "I'll send for Harding today," she said. "I'll send for Harding today," he said. "You finish the rebuild schedule, and you tell me everything you're thinking about that letter, every possibility, because two people thinking around a corner see more than one." She pulled her written notes from her pocket and put them on the table. He read them without expression. When he was done, he looked up and said, "The third one, you think it's most likely?" "Yes, so do I." He folded the notes and handed them back. "We plan for all three. We tell Harding all three, and Thursday you walk into that church and whoever is in it, you're not alone." She looked at him for a moment. At the steadiness of him, that quality she had identified in the first 5 minutes and had spent 23 days understanding better. Not coldness, not distance. The particular warmth of a man who does not perform care but enacts it quietly in the way he handles things that matter. "All right," she said. He sent the writer to Laramie within the hour. Harding arrived Thursday morning at 10 o'clock with Reeves and a third man, a deputy named Calloway, who was built like a barn door and said approximately 4 words during the entire briefing, all of them useful. They sat at the kitchen table, Harding, Caleb, Abigail, and Reeves with Calloway, standing at the door like a piece of furniture that was paying close attention, and Abigail laid out all 3 scenarios in the same clean cross-referenced way. She laid out account discrepancies, and Harding listened to all of it and then said, "The third scenario, that's your working assumption?" "Yes," she said. "Mine too." He looked at the letter again. "The handwriting. Have you seen it before?" "No. Marsh has a law clerk, young man named Gideon Price, works out of his house office." Harding looked at Reeves. "We've been watching Price. He's been getting nervous for 2 weeks ever since the land office complaint went in." "You think it's him?" Abigail said. "I think it might be." Harding set the letter down. "And I think if Marsh found out Price was trying to talk, he would absolutely use that situation to get you somewhere controllable." He looked at her directly. "Which makes this both a genuine informant and a trap. Your third scenario." She looked at her notes. "So we go." "We go," Harding said. "You walk in at 7. You hear what Price or whoever it is has to say. You keep them talking as long as you can. Because we will be positioned around that church before 5 o'clock. And if Marsh or any of his men show up within 3 blocks of it, we will know." Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with a pot of coffee and the expression of someone who has been listening from the hallway and is not certain whether to be frightened or fascinated. "You'll need an excuse to be in town," she said. Everyone looked at her. Clara set the coffee pot down. If Abigail simply rides to town on Thursday evening alone, it looks like she received a message and is going to meet someone. Marsh will know. But if 2 women ride to town together to do errands before the shops close, and one of them happens to step into a church while the other is at the general store. She paused. "That looks like nothing." Harding looked at Clara, then at Abigail, then back at Clara. "She's not wrong," he said. Abigail looked at her sister. Clara met her eyes. No performance, no charm. Just the plain direct look of a woman trying to be useful in the way that was actually needed. "All right," Abigail said. "We go together." Thursday afternoon arrived with the specific slowness of time before something important. Abigail went over the accounts twice, not because they needed it, but because it steadied her hands and her mind in the way that numbers always did. The cleanness of figures that meant exactly what they said and nothing else. Clara sat across from her and did not talk, which was its own kind of gift. At 4 o'clock, Caleb came to find her. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and looked at her, the way he had been looking at her more often lately, longer than necessary, in the way of a man who has something to say, and has not yet found the version of it that doesn't cost him too much. "I want to come with you," he said. "You can't. It would change the look of it." "I know." He turned the hat. "I don't like it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Harding's good." "I know. And you're—" He stopped, started again. "You know what you're doing." "I usually do." He looked at her. "Abigail." She looked up from the ledger. "Be careful," he said. Just that. Quiet and direct, and underneath it something that had been building for 23 days and did not yet have a name, but was not nothing. "I will," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he put his hat on and went back out, and she looked at the figures on the page and told herself to breathe, and breathed. The church in Red Rock was a plain building at the end of the main street, white-painted and modest, the kind of building that asks nothing of the people who enter it. She and Clara had ridden in at 5:30. Clara went to the general store with an actual list from May. Not a pretense, a real list. Because May had said there was no point in a cover story that needed lying to maintain when the truth would do the same job. Abigail had walked the town at a normal pace, said hello to the people she recognized, stopped to speak to Garrett at the supply counter about a lumber quote, and given Harding and his deputies an hour and a half to settle into their positions. At 7:05, she walked into the church. It was dim inside the evening light coming through plain glass windows. 2 candles burned at the front. In the third pew from the back, on the left side, a young man sat with his hat on his knees and his shoulders carrying the weight of someone who has made a decision and is discovering that decisions do not get lighter once made, only different. He was perhaps 25. Dark coat. Hands that shook slightly when he heard her footsteps. "Mr. Price," she said. He looked up. His face was the face of someone who has been frightened for a long time and is relieved to have arrived at the moment they have been dreading, because at least the dreading is over. "Miss Carter," he said. "Thank you for coming." She sat down in the pew across the aisle from him. She kept her voice low and her posture calm. "Tell me what you know," she said. He told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was worse than she had expected. Marsh had not simply been overcharging Caleb Whitmore. He had been doing it the same scheme, the same mill, the same cut arrangement to 4 other ranches across the territory. 3 of them had already signed over their land. 1 family had left Wyoming entirely. The 4th had held out, and their barn had burned same as Whitmore's, and they had signed 2 weeks later. Price had drafted 3 of those contracts. He had known what he was doing, and he had done it because Marsh paid well, and because he had told himself it was just business, and because it was easier to write the words than to think about what they meant for the families whose names went on the bottom line. "Why now?" she said, when he paused. "Why come forward now?" He looked at his hands. "Because of you," he said. "Because Marsh told me he'd offered you $50 for the Whitmore invoices, and you closed the door on him." He looked up. "And because after you did that, he told his men to burn the barn, and I was in the room when he said it." He swallowed. "I helped him steal from people. I won't help him burn them out." She looked at him for a long moment. "You'll testify to all of this," she said. "To Marshal Harding, in writing, in court if it comes to that." "Yes." "You understand what that means for you?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I did. I want to do the thing that comes after." She stood. She looked toward the door, the plain wooden door of the plain white church, and then she looked back at him. "Stay here," she said. "Don't move. There are people outside who are going to want to speak with you, and you are going to be all right." She paused. "Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." She walked to the door. She opened it, and stopped. Because Virgil Marsh was standing on the church steps. He had 2 men behind him, the same 2 from the porch, the ones who had made no particular effort to look like anything other than what they were, and he was looking at her with the smile she knew now, the one that had a point on it. "Miss Carter," he said. "I had a feeling you'd be here." She did not step back. She stood in the doorway with the candlelight behind her and looked at him and thought very clearly. Harding is 3 blocks away. Reeves is 1 block. Calloway is around the corner. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "you really should have stopped at the barn." Something moved in his expression. The smile stayed, but something underneath it shifted. "I'm going to need you to step aside," he said. "I have business with the young man inside." "No," she said. One of the men behind him moved forward. She did not move. She held the doorframe, and she did not move, and she looked at Marsh with the same level steadiness she had used at the kitchen table, and the land office, and the midnight accounting sessions, and every other moment in the last 23 days when the right thing to do was hold the line and not flinch. "You're going to want to think carefully about what you do next," she said, "because there are 4 federal officers within 1 block of this building, and one of them has been watching you since you came around the corner." She tilted her head slightly. "And you just approached a federal witness on the steps of a church with 2 men who burned a barn. That's not a land dispute anymore, Mr. Marsh. That's something considerably more serious." He looked at her. She looked back, and from the street to her left, she heard the sound of boots, deliberate, unhurried, the pace of men who do not need to hurry, and Harding's voice calm as a clear day saying, "Virgil Marsh, keep your hands where I can see them." Marsh did not move for a long moment. His eyes stayed on Abigail, on her face, specifically looking for the thing he had been looking for since the property line. The fracture. The place where she would step back. She did not step back. She watched his hands come up slowly, the capable smile going somewhere it could not come back from, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Done. Not finished. The territory court would take months, and Price's testimony would have to be given, and protected, and verified. And there were 4 other families whose land had been taken, and that was its own long reckoning. But this part, this specific moment, done. Harding reached the steps. Reeves was behind him. Calloway came around the other side, and the 2 men with Marsh found themselves running the arithmetic of the situation and arriving at the only reasonable conclusion. "Gideon Price is inside," Abigail said to Harding. "He's ready to make a full statement." Harding looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes." He nodded. He went up the steps past her into the church, and Reeves managed Marsh and Calloway managed the other 2. And on the street behind all of it, Clara was standing outside the general store with May's errands in a bag, and an expression that had moved all the way past fear and out the other side into something that looked like pride. Abigail came down the steps. She walked to her sister. Clara looked at her. Then she reached out and gripped Abigail's arm. Just that, just the grip, no words. And Abigail looked at her hand, and then at her face, and thought about 30 years of being the responsible one. The one who cleaned up, the one who stayed and handled it, and thought about what it felt like to have handled it for yourself. "We should get home," Abigail said. "Yes," Clara said. They rode home in the early dark, and the stars came out one by one, the way they did in Wyoming, enormous, and unhurried, and certain of themselves. And when they came through the gate, Caleb was in the yard. I was supposed to be in the house. Harding had been very clear that he should stay on the property. But he was in the yard standing next to Pete, and when he saw the 2 women ride in his whole body, did a thing that Abigail could not have described precisely, but that she understood completely, a setting down the physical relief of a man who has been holding his breath for 2 hours and has just been permitted to stop. She dismounted. She walked to him. She stopped 3 feet away and looked at his face in the starlight. "Marsh is in custody," she said. Price gave a full statement. "There are 4 other properties involved. Harding is going to need documentation on all of them, and I'm probably going to be called as a material witness." She paused. "It's going to be a long few months." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "Sure." "Caleb." She said his name, his first name, which she had not said before, which arrived in the air between them, with a weight and a rightness she had not planned. "I'm sure." He looked at her. That look, the one that had moved past measuring, and past guarding, and past all the distances a man puts between himself and the things he is afraid to lose again, looked back at her openly, in the dark Wyoming yard in front of Pete, who had the good sense to find something to look at in the other direction. He reached out. His hand found hers, and he held it, not gently, not tentatively, But the way a man holds something he has decided he is not letting go of, and she looked down at their hands and then up at his face, and neither of them said anything, because some things do not need to be said at the moment they happen. They are just true. Pete coughed from a respectful distance. "I'll put the horses up," he said to no one in particular, and walked away with the air of a man who has done his job. Clara went inside without looking back, and Abigail stood in the yard with Caleb's hand around hers, and the stars overhead, and the ranch around them, not ruined, not stolen, not finished, and she thought about a letter she had read on a Tuesday morning in Missouri, and a train she had almost not boarded, and a name that wasn't hers that had carried her all the way here, to this yard, this man, this particular impossible honest thing. 6 weeks, he said quietly. She looked up. "After the 30 days, he said. "You agreed to 6 weeks. I remember. The barn will be rebuilt before that." He looked at her. "What happens after 6 weeks?" She looked at him for a long moment. "We renegotiate," she said. His hand tightened around hers, just slightly, just enough. "Fair enough," he said, and the night settled around them quiet and enormous, and full of everything that had not yet been said, but was building itself steadily and honestly, out of hard work and trust, and the kind of time that cannot be rushed and does not need to be. But there was still one thing she did not know. One envelope still sealed, one piece of the story that had not yet arrived, because in the morning a letter would come from the territorial court in Cheyenne, and it would not say what any of them expected, and what it said would change everything about what came next. The letter arrived with the morning rider at 7:30. Abigail was already at the kitchen table with the accounts when she heard the hoofbeats, and she looked up before the rider reached the gate, the way she had learned to look up with attention, not alarm reading the pace of the arrival before it announced itself. This rider was moving at a steady trot. Official business, not emergency. She was at the door when Pete took the envelope. He looked at the return address and then at her and handed it over without a word. Territorial Court of Wyoming, Cheyenne. She took it inside, set it on the table, looked at it for a moment with her hands flat on either side, the way she looked at documents she needed to read without letting what she wanted them to say interfere with what they actually said. Then she opened it. She read it once, twice, set it down. Caleb came in from the barn at 8 smelling of sawdust and morning work. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She looked up. "Sit down." He sat. She slid the letter across the table. He read it. She watched his face the way she had learned to watch it for the small things, the shifts that happened below the surface before they reached his expression. She saw him reach the second paragraph. Saw something tighten. Saw him go back to the beginning and read it again. He set the letter down. "The court is dismissing the fraud claim," he said. "The land fraud claim," she said carefully. "The overcharging case, the invoices, the mill scheme that stands. Harding's extortion charge stands. But the territorial land claim, the one that would have gotten the other 4 families their properties back." She paused. "Marsh's lawyer filed a procedural challenge. The court says the documentation isn't sufficient to prove intent in a land seizure case under territorial statute. They need original signed contracts showing coercion, not just the financial pattern. The families signed voluntarily," Caleb said. "Under pressure they couldn't prove. Yes. So Marsh keeps the land, unless someone can produce a signed document showing he used explicit threats or illegal means to compel the sales." She looked at the letter. Which is what Price's testimony was supposed to provide. But Price was a clerk. He drafted contracts. He wasn't in the room for the threats. She picked up the letter and set it down again. "The court says the testimony establishes awareness of fraud, but not direct coercion in the specific land transactions." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Those 4 families," he said. "Yes. One of them left Wyoming entirely." "I know." He looked at the table. "So Marsh loses the extortion charge. He loses the mill scheme. He loses Hendricks as a free man if Harding can find him. But he keeps 4 ranches. Unless we find something else?" She looked at him directly. "I'm not done." He looked up. "I've been through every document we have," she said. "And there's something I kept coming back to that I didn't understand at first. In the original land sale agreements, the three I could find copies of through the court filing, there's a clause, standard language or it looks standard, but the acreage figures are wrong." He frowned. "Wrong how?" "Each property was sold at an assessed value. The assessment is based on acreage, but the acreage in the contracts is lower than the recorded acreage in the original homestead filings." She turned her notes to face him. "Not by accident, by exactly 12% in each case." He stared at her notes. "The same 12%, he said slowly. "The same figure as the mill overcharging, the same percentage Hendricks was taking." She looked at him. "It's a formula, Caleb. Someone built a formula that ran across every piece of this operation. Undercount the acreage, undervalue the land by at a suppressed price. The families signed contracts for land that was fraudulently assessed. That's not just pressure, that's falsification of a legal document." The kitchen was very still. "That's your coercion," he said. "That's the paper trail of it," she said. "If the original homestead filings show higher acreage than the sale contracts, and the sale contracts bear Marsh's lawyer's drafting mark, then someone deliberately falsified those figures. That's not a procedural question. That's fraud on the face of the document." He looked at her notes, at the figures, at the clean parallel columns she had built over the last week from every piece of documentation she could find. "The original homestead filings," he said. "Where are they?" "Land office in Cheyenne." She held his gaze. "We need to go back." He picked up the letter. He folded it once and put it in his vest pocket. Then he looked at her with the expression she knew now. Not the measuring look, not the controlled stillness, but the one underneath all of those, the one that had no distance in it. "How long have you been working on this?" he said. "Since the night after Marsh was arrested." She looked at her notes. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking there was something in the documents I'd missed, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't name." She paused. "I've been wrong about things before, but not about numbers. Numbers don't have reasons to lie." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have told me," he said, "what you were working on. I didn't want to tell you something I wasn't sure of." She met his eyes. "You've had enough people tell you things that turned out not to be true. I wasn't going to do that." He looked at her for a long time. "Abigail," he said. "Yes." "You have been here for 26 days. "Yes. In 26 days, you rebuilt accounts that were destroyed over 3 years. You identified a fraud scheme that a territorial court missed. You faced down Virgil Marsh on a church porch without flinching. And now you're telling me there's a second layer that could get 4 families their land back." He paused. "All of that." "The numbers were there," she said. "I just read them." "That's not what I'm saying." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm saying, do you know what you are? Do you actually know?" She looked at him. She did not answer because the question felt like something she should be careful with, like a ledger entry that needed to balance before she committed it. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said quietly. "And you have been treating that like it's a minor detail." She looked at the table. "People have always found it useful," she said. "My capability. They've been grateful for it. But it's not the same as—" She stopped. "The same as what?" She looked up. "The same as being wanted, for more than what you can do." The kitchen was very quiet. He did not look away. "I know," he said. "I know it's not the same. And I know I haven't." He stopped. Pressed his lips together. Started again, the way he always started again, when the words he had were not the right ones, and he was determined to find the right ones anyway. "I haven't said it plainly. I've said things around it. I've said stay, and I've said fair enough, and I've held your hand in the yard, and I've let you see me reading that column of figures from 1879, without explaining what it meant." He looked at her steadily. "But I haven't said the plain thing." She waited. "I want you here," he said. "Not because the accounts need doing, not because the ranch needs managing, because He stopped. "Because the house is different with you in it. Because I laughed last week for the first time in 3 years, And the reason was something you said. Because when I woke up this morning, the first thing I thought about was whether you'd slept enough. And that's not a thought a man has about an employee. He held her gaze. I want you here because I want you. That's the plain thing. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the train. About $3 and a borrowed name and a platform in Wyoming where a tall man with hard eyes had looked at her letter and looked at her and said, "You're not her." And she had thought in that moment that she was about to be sent back to nothing. She thought about what nothing had become. "I'm not Clara," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "No," he said. "You're not. You didn't get what you asked for. I got something I didn't know to ask for." He looked at her with the steadiness that was she understood now, not coldness at all, but the particular warmth of a man who does not offer what he cannot sustain. "That's better." She looked at her hands, at the ledger, at the figures she had built from nothing, from chaos, from the accumulated mess of 3 years of theft and neglect into something that made sense. "We still have to go to Cheyenne," she said. "I know. The 4 families. I know." He reached across the table. His hand covered hers. "We'll go. We'll do it right." He paused. "But first, before we go anywhere." He waited until she looked up. "What do you want, Abigail? Not what the ranch needs, not what's right. What do you want?" She had not been asked that in a very long time. She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything honestly, without letting what she was supposed to want interfere with what she actually did. "I want to stay," she said. "Not for 6 weeks. Not on a renegotiated contract." She looked at him steadily. "I want to stay because this place is the first place I have ever been where what I am is enough. Not useful, not capable, just enough." She paused. "And I want to know that you see me. All of it. The stubbornness and the midnight accounts, and the way I closed the door on Marsh, and the fact that I came here under my sister's name, and the $3 and all of it." She held his gaze. "I want to know that you see all of that and still want me here." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "I see all of it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." He turned her hand over in his and held it properly, the way he had in the yard, with the certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it. And neither of them said anything else for a moment, because there was nothing else that needed to be said right now, only everything that needed to be built, and that was a different kind of conversation. May appeared in the kitchen doorway with a pot of coffee and looked at the two of them and the space between them and said with the completeness of a woman who has been waiting a considerable amount of time, "Finally." Then she poured the coffee and went back to the stove, and Abigail laughed a real laugh, the kind that arrives before you decide to have it. And Caleb looked at her face when she laughed with the expression of a man who has just seen something he intends to see again as many times as possible. And the morning went on around them, warm and ordinary, and entirely changed. They left for Cheyenne 2 days later. Harding met them at the land office with Reeves and a territorial judge named Alderman, who had the manner of a man who had heard a great deal in his career and was prepared to hear more. Abigail spread the documentation on the conference table, original homestead filings pulled from the land office records, the 3 sale contracts, her acreage comparison notes, and the parallel percentage analysis that connected the mill scheme to the land assessments, and she walked Judge Alderman through it, the same way she had walked Clerk Aldis through the invoices specific numbered cross-referenced, without editorializing. Alderman listened. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without hesitation. Then he looked at the figures and then at Harding and said, "This is falsification of recorded land assessment. That's a territorial crime independent of the coercion question." He looked back at the documents. "If these filings can be authenticated against the county originals—" "They're already authenticated," Abigail said, and produced the certification letter from the Cheyenne Land Office archive that she had requested 3 days ago, because she had learned by now that the document you anticipate needing is the one that matters most. Alderman looked at the letter, then at her. "You requested this before the court dismissed the original claim," he said. "Yes. Before you knew you'd need it." "I knew I might need it." She kept her voice even. I believed there was something in the acreage figures before I could prove it. The certification was a precaution. That's not how most people approach legal documentation, he said. I'm a bookkeeper, she said. We anticipate. Alderman looked at Harding. Harding looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Abigail with the expression that was not the measuring look anymore, and had not been for several days. I'm reopening the land claim, Alderman said. On the basis of documented falsification of territorial records, Marsh's attorney will have 5 days to respond. He picked up the certification letter. Miss Carter, I may need you as a witness. I'll be available, she said. Outside the land office in the thin Cheyenne sunshine, Harding shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Abigail and shook hers with the same directness. You know, he said, I've been doing this work for 12 years. I've had lawyers, clerks, deputies, judges. He looked at her. None of them would have caught the acreage. Someone would have, she said. Maybe. Eventually. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the railing. The 4 families who lost their land. One of them is still in Wyoming. Couple in eastern Colorado. The one who left entirely went to Kansas. He paused. If the claim holds, they get first right of recovery. Will they come back? Caleb said. Depends on whether there's anything to come back to. Harding looked at him. Marsh has been running those properties at minimum effort. They'll need work. He glanced at Abigail. They'll need someone who knows how to look at accounts that have been deliberately mismanaged and figure out what's real. She looked at him steadily. One ranch at a time, Marshal. He almost smiled. Fair enough. He tipped his hat and walked away, and Reeves followed, and the Cheyenne street settled back into its ordinary noise, and Caleb stood beside her in the thin sunshine and said nothing for a moment. One ranch at a time, he said. Yes. Starting with ours. She looked at him. At the way he had said ours without preamble, without ceremony, dropped into the sentence, the way you drop something that belongs there. Starting with ours, she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back to the hotel, and Clara was waiting on the steps she had come, because Abigail had asked, and because it turned out that Clara, given something real to do, was more reliable than her history suggested, and she looked at the two of them and said, Well, the claim is reopened, Abigail said. Clara let out a long breath. And the rest of it? Abigail looked at Caleb. He looked at her. Neither of them performed anything. That too, she said. Clara looked at them for a moment. Then she nodded once firmly with the expression of a woman paying a debt she had owed for a long time. Good, she said. That's good, Abby. She said it quietly with something in it that had nothing to do with charm. You deserve the good things. Abigail looked at her sister. At the particular imperfect, complicated face of the person who had sent her 500 miles under a borrowed name and accidentally delivered her to the exact life she had not known she needed. I know, she said. Clara blinked. Then she laughed, short, surprised, the laugh of someone who has expected to be forgiven, grudgingly, and has received something better than that. She reached out and gripped Abigail's arm the way she had on the church steps. Then she let go and went inside, because Clara had always known when a scene was over and when to exit it. The ride back to Red Rock took 2 days. They stopped the first night at a way station where the proprietor had a fire going and a decent meal, and the good sense not to ask questions about the 3 of them, or why the 2 women were traveling with a man who was not introduced as a husband. Abigail sat across the fire from Caleb, and they talked, really talked, the kind of talking that happens when the urgent things are handled, and what remains is the actual texture of 2 people's lives laid out for examination. She told him about Missouri, about the school, about the father who had died when she was 19, and the years after that spent being the capable one, the useful one, the one who made sure Clara ate and the rent was paid and the impossible things got managed. She told him about the loneliness of it, not the romantic loneliness of stories, but the specific practical loneliness of a person who is so consistently competent that people forget to ask whether she is all right. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "The column that stopped in February of 1879, in the 3rd ledger." She went very still. "Eleanor's handwriting," he said. "She handled the books. She was..." He paused. She was the one who caught the overcharging first, noted it in the margin. I found it when I went back through after she died and I thought... He stopped. I thought it was just a note. I didn't understand what she was seeing. He looked at the fire. If I'd understood what she was pointing at, maybe Hendricks would have been caught 3 years earlier, and the whole scheme with Marsh would never have... Stop, Abigail said. He looked at her. You are not responsible for what you didn't know to look for, she said. It was the same thing she had said to him about Hendricks on the first night, and she said it the same way flatly without softness, because the truth did not need softening. Eleanor saw something and noted it. She didn't know what it was either, or she would have told you. She was a careful woman who noticed a discrepancy and wrote it down. That's not a failure. That's exactly the right thing. She looked at him steadily. She'd be glad someone finished it. He looked at the fire for a long time. You would have liked her, he said finally. Yes, Abigail said. I think I would have. He looked at her then. The firelight did things to his face that the harsh Wyoming daylight didn't show the lines of it, the weariness and the warmth, both visible at once. She would have liked you, he said. She always said what she meant. She hated people who talked around things. He almost smiled. She would have found you extremely refreshing. That sounds like a compliment. It is. He looked at her. Most things I say to you are. She looked at the fire. Her hands were in her lap, and they were not shaking, and she thought this is what it feels like. Not the version from stories, not the performed version, but the real one, sitting across a fire from a person who sees you fully, and says so, without decoration, and feeling for the first time in a very long time, correctly seen. Clara was already asleep in her bedroll. Pete was at the far end of the way station, giving them the privacy of a man who understood exactly what kind of conversation was happening, and had the grace not to interrupt it. There's something I need to ask you, Abigail said. Ask. She looked at him directly. The woman you wrote to. The advertisement Clara placed. You were looking for a wife. That was the arrangement. She kept her voice even. And then Clara didn't come, and I did, and everything that happened after was different. Not what you planned for. She paused. I want to know if you still think about the fact that you were supposed to be getting someone else. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want an honest answer? He said. I always want honest answers. In the first 5 minutes, he said. At the station. When I said you're not her, yes, I thought about it. He looked at his hands. I wasn't angry, I was tired. I'd been building up to that meeting for 3 months, and I'd convinced myself it was the right practical decision, and then the practical decision didn't show up. And what showed up instead was a woman with $3 and a suitcase, and the most direct pair of eyes I'd ever seen, looking at my broken ranch and asking what needed fixing. He looked up. After that, no. I never thought about it again. He said it simply. There was nothing to think about. She looked at him. Caleb, she said. Yes. I came here under my sister's name. I lied by omission for the entire train ride and the wagon ride and the first conversation we ever had. You corrected it at the first opportunity. I should have, Abigail. His voice was quiet, but it had the weight of something settled in it. You came 500 miles to do right by a man you didn't know. You told me the full truth as soon as you had the chance. You said no to $50 and closed a door in Marsh's face and drove to Laramie and sat in a land office and stood in a church doorway and rebuilt everything that had been stolen from this ranch. And you did all of it while carrying a name that wasn't yours with $3 and no guarantee that any of it would work out. He looked at her steadily. I don't care how you arrived. I care that you stayed. She held his gaze. She had spent 27 years waiting to be told that the person behind the capability was worth something on its own. She had spent 27 years being so good at managing everything that no one had thought to ask what she needed managed for her. She had not expected it to arrive in Wyoming from a man who asked fair enough and meant it every time. I'm going to stay, she said. I want you to know that's not a renegotiation anymore. That's not a contract. That's just what I'm going to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. Just that. Just the gesture, gentle and certain, and completely without hesitation, and said, "I know." The fire burned down. The way station settled into its nighttime quiet. Somewhere outside, the Wyoming darkness opened up enormous and unhurried, and it held the ranch and the rebuilt barn, and Pete's good work, and May's kitchen, and all the small true things that had been built over 26 days from nothing into something that mattered. She slept. They came home on a Tuesday. The ranch came into view from the top of the rise the way it always did, the house first, then the yard, then the half-rebuilt barn frame against the sky. And Abigail looked at it from horseback and felt something she had not felt looking at a place in 9 years. She felt like she was arriving, not returning. Danny was in the yard and called out when he saw them coming. May appeared on the porch with her apron on and her expression of maximum neutrality that fooled nobody. And she looked at Caleb and Abigail and their horses close together on the road and said, "Supper's on, don't track mud in." Pete unsaddled the horses. Clara went to help May without being asked, which was noted by everyone, and mentioned by nobody. Danny talked about the barn progress with the energy of a man who had worked hard in their absence and was proud of it and deserved to be. Caleb stood in the yard and looked at the barn frame. Abigail stood beside him. "3 more weeks on the timber," she said. "If the lumber delivery comes on schedule." "It'll come," he said. "I paid in advance." "I know, I did the invoice." She looked at the frame. "It's going to be better than the original. Danny knows what he's doing." "He does." Caleb looked at the barn for a moment longer. Then he looked at the house, at the yard, at the whole of it, the thing that had almost been taken, the thing that had been rebuilt from its own bones, the thing that was standing. "This ranch," he said. "Yes. I almost lost it." "You didn't. Not because of anything I did." He looked at her. "Because you read numbers that other people looked at and didn't see. Because you stayed up until midnight on the 5th day you'd ever been here. Because you drove to Laramie and faced down a land office clerk and a federal marshal and Virgil Marsh on a church porch and a territorial judge in Cheyenne." He looked at her steadily. "Because you came here with $3 and your sister's name, and you refused at every single point to be less than what you are." She looked at him. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "No," he said. "But you started it, and you didn't stop." He turned to face her fully. "I want to ask you something. Ask." He looked at her with the directness that was the most consistent thing about him, the quality that had been there from the first moment on the platform, through every ledger and every courtroom, and every late-night conversation at the kitchen table, unchanging. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, not quite. The tone of a man who is asking, but has also already decided what he is asking, and is not uncertain about any part of it. Not because the ranch needs a bookkeeper. Not because you need a home. Because we do this better together than either of us does alone, and because I want to spend the rest of my life watching you read a room and figure out what's actually happening in it. He paused. "Because I love you, plainly and completely. That's the plain thing." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter on a Tuesday morning. The train. The platform. "You're not her." She thought about what she had become in the space between that moment and this one. "Yes," she said. Not because she needed him. Not because the ranch was safe now, or the accounts were clean, or the barn was being rebuilt, and the 4 families might get their land back. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had somewhere to go. She had built it herself. She knew exactly where she stood and what she was worth. Because she had come 500 miles under a borrowed name and found something she had not known she was looking for. Because he had offered her 30 days and $8, and she had turned it into something neither of them had planned for. Because she was capable and stubborn, and she read rooms and she closed doors on men who offered her $50 to betray the truth. And this man looked at all of that and called it love. Because he saw her. Because she chose him. May called from the porch, "Supper." She said it with the particular cadence of a woman who has already known the outcome of this conversation for approximately 25 days and is deeply gratified to have been right. Pete whooped from the barn. Danny laughed. Clara appeared beside May on the porch and pressed both hands over her mouth and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing she had done in years. Caleb looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Caleb. "Come on," she said. "May doesn't like waiting." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked toward the house together, toward the light in the window, and the smell of supper, and the sound of Pete still making noise in the barn, and Clara saying something that made May actually smile, and the Wyoming evening opened up around them, enormous and unhurried, and absolutely certain of itself. She had come here with $3 and a name that wasn't hers. She was leaving nothing behind and taking everything forward. The accounts she had rebuilt, the fraud she had uncovered, the family. She was choosing the ranch that was standing because she had refused to let it fall. She had not come to Red Rock, Wyoming, to find a home. She had come to do the right thing for a man she'd never met, with nothing in her hand and no guarantee of anything waiting on the other side. And the right thing, it turned out, had been exactly where she was going all along. Some women are sent away to be forgotten. Abigail Carter went 500 miles under the wrong name and came home to herself, and she built everything that mattered out of honesty, hard work, and the absolute refusal to be anything less than what she was. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had simply needed to arrive somewhere that knew it.